So what you're looking at is, this is a survey done by NACAC. So NACAC's the National Association of College Admissions Counselors. They do this survey every year where they reach out to college admission folk, and they ask them, just of these various criteria, can you give us a sense in terms of their rankings in terms of either being considerable or moderate importance. And they do this survey year after year, and every year they do this survey. The number one factor that colleges look at, it comes in the same year after year, and that number one thing that they're looking at is a student's transcript. A student's grades, their day in and day out performance in school. The next thing that they're looking at is the strength of the curriculum. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves? Did they take advantage of the opportunities presented to them here at Lexington High? And then depending on how you do the math, it's usually sort of the third or fourth most important thing that colleges are looking at are those standardized testing scores. But even those colleges that are getting, for instance, 40,000 plus applications from students a year, they are still reading the essays from every single applicant. They are reading the counselor recommendations. They are reading the teacher recommendations. They are looking at extracurricular activities and positions of leadership or any work experience that students have. And all of that is what's weighed into that final decision. And again, the term you'll hear around this is called holistic review. And what they're trying to do with holistic review is they're trying to get to know the applicant as a person, not just a number. So again, even those larger colleges that are getting what seems like an overwhelming number of applicants, it's not like they're just taking the student's GPA and their students' standardized testing scores, putting it in some kind of algorithm or formula, getting a number back, and then making that admissions decision based on that number. All of these factors are going to be weighed into that final admissions decision. And then just more and more schools, an increasingly number of schools are going what they call test optional. So for the test optional schools, students are in complete control of their scores. It's up to them whether they decide they're actually going to send them or not. And you can see it's an increasingly list of selective schools that are going test optional. It's not just kind of more rural schools or schools that we've never heard of or schools that usually don't appear on our students list. And I'll just point out two. Here, University of Chicago just went test optional. They went test optional over the summer, got a lot of publicity around that. And then the other one that recently went test optional this fall is Colby College. And when you talk to the admission folk who have gone from schools who have gone test optional, and you ask them, why did you go test optional? Essentially what you'll hear is something along these lines. It goes like this. True, we just know for a certain percentage of students, we just know those standardized testing scores are not going to be reflective of who that student is and what that student is capable of. It's not going to be predictive of how well they're going to do at our particular institution. And I don't even need to see standardized testing scores in order to be able to evaluate that application. I can look at all those other features or criteria that we saw on that previous slide, and that's going to give me a good picture in terms of how well that student's going to do on our campus. And the thing with the college admission folk, they're not playing gotcha here. They're not trying to kind of mislead families or mislead students. It's not like they're saying, okay, students are coming from Lexington High. Chances are probably pretty high that somewhere in their high school career they probably took standardized tests. They're applying to a test optional school, they didn't send scores, therefore those scores must be horrible, therefore that student's not getting in. That's not the game that the test optional movement is playing. Again, really what they're trying to do is they're trying to empower the student, give the student the choice as to whether or not they feel those scores are truly reflective of who they are and what they're capable of. And the nice thing with the test optional movement, there's a number of schools that have been test optional for a number of years now, and they have really nice data that shows that the classes that they've admitted since they've gone test optional are just as strong, if not stronger, than the classes that they admitted when they were considered standardized testing scores. There are a couple caveats to the test optional movement, and I just want to cover them briefly. The first one is just if there's any recruited athletes or parents or guardians of recruited athletes, especially if you're looking at some of the Division III schools, especially if you're looking at some of the NESCAC schools, for instance, Connecticut College. Connecticut College admits test optionally, but for their recruited athletes, those coaches are going to need standardized testing scores. We don't have time to get into it this morning, but it ties into the whole academic index score, where that coach, just for their recruiting class, that recruiting class needs to come in with a certain number around that academic index score, and standardized tests are part of that academic index score. So just know, if you're being a recruited athlete, chances are you're going to need standardized testing scores, even though you might be applying to a test optional school. The other caveat with that test optional is just around merit aid. So not to kind of depress all of us with the skyrocketing cost of tuition, but one way in which colleges are trying to make that tuition bill a little bit more affordable is through granting merit aid. And what merit aid is generally non-need-based financial aid. And here's just an example. This is Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. But you can see standardized testing scores are factored into this merit aid award. So you can see, as this strong student, 3.5 GPA, but you can see as those ACT scores go up, the amount of that merit aid award is going to go up for those particular students. And I don't put this slide up here to ratchet up the pressure around standardized testing and be like, oh my gosh, we've got to get as perfect score as we can, so that we're going to end up with more merit aid. It's more just to be aware that there are schools out there that are test optional in terms of their admissions, but when they grant merit aid awards, if they offer merit aid awards, they might consider standardized testing scores. And you can always just call them and ask if you're not sure, and they'll give you an honest answer around this. And then the other one is just to put it on your radar that more and more colleges, especially outside of the New England area, if you're willing to expand the list a little bit, colleges who aren't in the Northeast, even colleges in the Northeast, but they really love sort of our New England students. They particularly like Lexington High students because they know just how academically prepared they are. So to try to entice them to come, oftentimes more and more colleges are taking advantage of this merit aid. So just to have that on your radar. So then the question that I get at this point in the presentation is always like, all right, Drew, so we're in 2019 now, right? We know standardized testing, not the be-all, end-all of the college admission process. We know they're doing that holistic review. We know more and more schools are going test optional. More and more competitive schools are going test optional. More and more schools are saying, like, we don't even need standardized testing scores in order to be able to evaluate an applicant. So why am I up here this morning? Why are all you here this morning? Why are we still talking about standardized testing and looking at this kind of infamous bell curve once again? And there's a couple pressures that are preserving standardized testing. Probably the biggest one is just more and more students, both internationally and domestically, are applying to our college system. So just increasingly, more and more students are on a pre-college track. Colleges, they're just increasingly faced with applicants from schools that they might not know anything of that school. So they might not have gotten an application from anyone from that school. They might not have accepted a student from that school. And even for those students, it's still going to be holistic review. Those standardized testing scores, it's still just going to be used in context of everything else. But it does, for those college admission folks, when they're in that position, the standardized testing piece, it gives them an objective piece of data. It just gives them a little bit of context in which to evaluate that transcript, evaluate those grades, evaluate those recommendations. And for lack of a better term here, this is where coming from Lexington High gives your students a little bit of an advantage in this process, just because Lexington High is known throughout the country by almost all colleges and universities. It's known for its rigor, it's known for the strength of the curriculum, and it's known for just how well prepared your students are graduating from here, and their ability to do college level work and to take that next level. This is not to say that for those colleges who put weight on those standardized testing scores or want to see those standardized testing scores, it doesn't mean that they're not going to look at those scores and consider those scores, but it might not have that same weight as coming from a student where, again, that college admission person just has no history or no really kind of insight into that particular high school. And again, I'm going to hit you with a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. But if you only remember one slide from this presentation this morning, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests comes down to them having a testing plan. And that testing plan is pretty much answering 3 pretty straightforward questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? The idea of a testing plan, hopefully it will do a couple of things for your students. Hopefully, one, it will just reduce some of the anxiety around these tests, just knowing when it is that they're going to take them, so they're not taken off guard by it. And the other thing that hopefully it will do is just keep in mind, these are national tests. So nationally speaking, the vast majority of students kind of wake up on a Saturday morning and they're like, oh my gosh, I have the SAT today, and they go take the test and they walk out of there and they're like, that was horrible, but at least I'm done. But if you have a testing plan mapped out ahead of time, it just ensures that your students, hopefully they're not going to go in there cold. Hopefully they'll go in maybe a little bit of prep under their belt so they can put their best foot forward and kind of hit their full potential on these tests. A couple other points on this testing plan, and you'll hear me come back to this. Just keep in mind, performance on these tests, it correlates with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So the later that students take these tests, actually the better they perform on it. So our recommendation, and there's always exceptions to this, but statistically speaking, students are going to hit their peak scores on these tests late spring of junior year, fall of senior year. And we'll get into why that may be the case a little bit as we go through these tests. So I know there's huge pressures out there for early and often testing. Just keep testing, and start earlier, and earlier. But the vast majority of students are going to benefit actually by holding off a little bit, having more schooling under their belt, and testing actually a little bit later in their high school career. Having said that, there's always exceptions to this. But at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong way to do this, to come up with this testing plan. That best testing plan, or perfect testing plan as you will, it's really what's going to work best for you as a family and what's going to work best for your students. So I just encourage you, if you're hearing through the grapevine, right, you're hearing stories that go like this. Yeah, Drew, we started at the end of 8th grade. We've been prepping for this for 3 years now. My daughter's already taken the ACT 5 times, and especially for the juniors in the room, or even for some of the sophomores in the room. If you're hearing that and you're like, oh my gosh, like I don't even know what an ACT is, let alone having been working on this for 3 years, again, please don't hit the panic button. You're not behind in any way, shape, or form. There may have been a very, very good reason as to why that student needed to kind of move that timeline up and to start a little bit earlier. But anything you can do to try to just drown out the noise a little bit around this, not get kind of caught up in that whole early and often testing, and just kind of know that if this plan ends up being different than what a neighbor did, or what a best friend did, or what an older sibling did, again, do not worry. There are many, many different paths to success here, and at the end of the day, that perfect path is going to be what makes best sense for your student and what makes best sense for all of you. So in terms of the tests that we're talking about, here they are. PSAT, really just for practice. Colleges aren't making any admissions decisions based on a PSAT score. SAT, ACT is going to be the bulk of what we cover this morning. I'm going to do just a real quick dive into subject tests and then AP outside the scope of what we're going to cover this morning, but we'll have time for questions at the end of this. So if you have questions on any of this, if we don't cover it during this presentation, we'll take those questions again at the end. So let me just start with the PSAT. That P, it stands for preliminary. We think of it as practice for that SAT. Really the benefit of that PSAT comes from. It doesn't come from that high level score. I always encourage students and families, please do not get hung up on that high level score. Really the benefit of the PSAT comes from students are going to get access to their test booklet. They're also going to get an itemized score report that shows every question they get right and every question they get wrong. So the real value of the PSAT, if students have the discipline to do this, is to go back through that test booklet, look at those questions they got right, look at those questions they got wrong, and just at a high level, having a better sense of their overall strengths and weaknesses. Areas they know they need to hone up on when they take these tests, hopefully a little bit later in the spring, especially for juniors, when they take these tests for real. Just want to talk about the scoring real quickly, because the scoring of the PSAT, it always causes a little bit of confusion. So you can see that SAT is on that 200 to 800 point scale that we all know and love. That PSAT is on that 160 to 760 scale. So the question I always get is, all right, Drew, so the PSAT is only at a 760 instead of 800. So we get our math score back and we get our verbal score back. Because it's only out of 760, can we just add 40 points to it? And that would be the SAT score that my student would have gotten had he or she taken an SAT on that day. And you can kind of guess from the tone of my voice, the way I'm talking about this. The answer to that is, unfortunately, no, you can't. I won't go into the kind of the math behind this, but you can kind of see the way the slide is set up. It's vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is that PSAT score, you can use it as a baseline score. It is the score that that student would have gotten had that student taken an SAT on that day. So for instance, on the PSAT, if the student got 650 math, 650 verbal, that is the SAT score that they would have gotten, again, had they taken it on that day. So you can use it as a baseline score. But the reason why it only goes to 760 instead of 800, this is the College Board acknowledging that students are taking this test a little bit early. So for juniors, they're taking it in October of junior year. Again, students are going to peak on this late spring of junior year or fall of senior year, and then obviously sophomores, again, taking it early just to get them exposure to a standardized test. But the reason why it goes to 760 is just those hardest math questions, for instance, that are on the SAT in that 760 to 800 point range, it's just, those questions just aren't on the PSAT. So that's why it's cut off at 760. Similarly, there's some easier questions on the PSAT in that 160 to 200 point range that just aren't on that SAT. So that's why the College Board, when they talk about this, they talk about the PSAT and SAT being on the same scale, which obviously, I mean, it's 160 to 760 instead of 200 to 800, but they're taking that scale and they're just kind of shifting it to the left. And again, the real value of that PSAT, identifying overall strengths and weaknesses, and anytime students get a chance to take a real test, especially that doesn't count in official setting, it's good practice for them. And then just real quickly, just to walk you through that PSAT score report in terms of what all those numbers mean. So again, here's at the high level. Again, I encourage you not to get hung up with these scores here, because where students start on a PSAT and where they end on their official SAT, often very, very different places. Again, just due to the timing of when they're taking these tests. But here's, you'll get that high level score. So here's the total score. It's that combined verbal and math score. There will also be, there's what they call a nationally representative percentage. That nationally representative percentage is always a little bit higher than what they call the user percentage. So the user percentage is the percentage of students who actually took the PSAT. That nationally representative one is just the College Board kind of having some fun with statistics and pretending if all possible students took the PSAT, how your students would rank within that given population. And then you'll also see this. So on those test scores, so you get, it's from 8 to 38 is the scoring on it. The trick here is to take this score and to multiply it by 20. That's going to put it on that 160 to 760 scale. So we get a 24, we multiply it by 20, it's 480 reading, it's 400 writing and language. So the advantage of knowing these scores is it just gives you an idea of how that evidence-based reading and writing score, the breakdown of it, how that score came to be. So what they're doing is they're taking the reading section and they're averaging it with the grammar portion. So to figure out whether or not your student was stronger on the grammar portion or on the reading portion, you need these test scores. So on this, it was 480 on reading, 400 on the writing and language. So clearly student a little bit stronger on the reading, but the average score there was a 440. And then on the math, again, you just take this 19.5 and you multiply it by 20. And then you get things called subscores. You'll see these on the SAT official score report as well. Colleges are not looking at any of this. Colleges are only looking at these top line scores when they're looking at those scores. But the sub-scores, it just gives you a breakdown in terms of how well students did on various sort of questions throughout it. And I'll just race through it quickly again. If you want more detail on it, it is in the college admissions guide what these terms actually mean. Command of evidence is just in the reading section. It's just how well students were able to support their answer. Words in context, that's how the SAT does vocab now. Expression of ideas, again, this is the grammar portions of the test and standard English conventions. And then you can see the breakdown here. There's some algebra. How well did students do on the algebra questions? How well did they do on the statistics questions? And then how well did they do on some of those more advanced math questions that appear on the PSAT? And again, it's on that 1 through 15 scale. It will give you a sense of it. And then that cross-test scores just throughout the test. Various questions are tagged as science questions. Various questions are tagged as history or social studies questions. Again, you'll see this on the SAT score report. Colleges have no time to do that deep of analysis on this. They're not paying any attention to that. And then just in terms of the College Board, they give a little bit of guidance in terms of areas that students can improve upon based on their various scores here. This is all algorithm based. It's not customized to your student in any way, shape, or form. But it gives you a little bit of an idea. And then just real quickly in terms of the National Merit Scholarship. I don't want to go into huge detail on this, but again, colleges are not making any admissions decision based on PSAT score. They are not making any admissions decisions on whether or not students were a National Merit got commendation, were a semifinalist or a finalist. So that National Merit Selection Index score, it is based on how well they did here. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking these scores, you're doubling them, and then you're adding them all together, and you get that selection index score. The National Merit semifinalist and finalist competition, it is incredibly competitive. It's less than 1% of students are going to end up getting commendation or being a semifinalist or a finalist. The qualifying score also to be a semifinalist or finalist also varies by state. And because because generally by most measures in terms of education, we usually rank number 1. In order to be equitable and try to get an equal distribution throughout the states of students who are going to get National Merit semifinalists or finalists, each state has its own qualifying score. And because we're in Massachusetts, our qualifying score is probably one of the top 3 most competitive scores in the country. So for students who are juniors, if they just missed being a National Merit semifinalist or finalist, again, it's not going to hurt them in their application process. Some colleges, especially some of the bigger state schools in the Southeast, again, kind of more of a merit thing than anything to entice our students to come. For those semifinalists or finalists, sometimes they just add more scholarship money to this. And again, not to depress us about the skyrocketing cost of college tuition, but that PSAT National Merit Semifinalist or Finalist Award, it used to cover 4 years of tuition. Now, I think it covers maybe books for the first year. They haven't adjusted it for inflation. I think it's around $2,500. Obviously, every little bit helps, so if you get it, you're obviously going to cash the check. But again, if you just miss the cutoff on this, it's not like you suddenly lost out on some $260,000 scholarship. And again, colleges know that states have different, depending on which state where you took it, it's going to be a different criteria. So again, they're not making admissions decisions on whether or not you were a semifinalist or a finalist. Obviously, if students get it, it's a nice feather in their cap, right? Nice little ego boost there. They'll obviously put it on their resume, right, that they got this. But again, do not hit the panic button if you thought maybe your student might have a score that qualifies them and it does not. So again, that's kind of the PSAT. Again, trying to keep that PSAT in context a little bit. But again, here is the real benefit of that PSAT. This is what students are going to get. This is the itemized score report. This shows them every single question they got right and every single question they got wrong. And then these sub-scores here, again, those were those test scores that we looked at, part of algebra, command of evidence things. So every one of these questions is going to get tagged. So we'll give you a sense in terms of which questions those students missed. And then before we do a deeper dive on that SAT versus ACT, I start with this slide because this is probably the #1 question that I get at this presentation. And the question goes something like this. Drew, we're applying in a fairly competitive college admissions landscape now. We're applying from Lexington High, we're applying in the Northeast. Can my son or daughter really get into his or her top school choice by submitting an ACT score? And the answer to that is they absolutely can. Colleges do not care whether students apply with an SAT or with an ACT. They do not have a preference for one test or the other. They do not see one test as being a better test and one test being as an inferior test. They are accepted equally. Just here in the Northeast, this is more of a historical artifact than anything. We still have kind of an SAT first bias, and that's because just historically, SAT always been more of an East Coast test and West Coast test, whereas ACT always been more of a Midwest test. Students in the Midwest more often took the ACT, but that landscape has totally changed. More and more of our students here in the Northeast are now choosing to take the ACT, and actually more and more students in the Midwest are actually choosing to take the SAT. But you can see, nationally speaking, actually more students take the ACT than take the SAT. So again, at the end of this, does not matter whether you choose to go down an SAT path or an ACT path. And just, this is the 30,000 foot view. This is just to frame our conversation as we do a deeper dive on these tests. So anytime a standardized test creator writes a standardized test, there's two components that go into the design of that test. The first is speed, the first is aptitude versus curriculum. So aptitude in its purest form, we think of that as being more of an IQ test, measuring a student's, quote, innate ability to learn, whereas curriculum-based test, exactly as it sounds, more in line with what students are doing day in and day out in school. The other component that goes into the design of these tests is speed versus power. So power speaks to the complexity of the questions on that test, the difficulty of the reading on that test, whereas speed, exactly as it sounds, the difficulty comes from the pace of it. Can students actually get through the test in the time allotted? And not to bring back vicious flashbacks of your own standardized testing experience, but for those of you who took what I'm calling that old SAT, you might remember tons of misdirection on that test, a lot of trying to make things seem much harder than they actually were. When I was working with students on that old SAT, we spent a lot of time just helping students get inside the test taker's head and really understanding what that question was asking. And when they were 50-50 on a question, understanding what makes a right answer right and a wrong answer wrong. In the year 2013, the College Board started facing some pretty heavy criticism for having a test like that. It felt random to students, it felt esoteric to them, it felt completely disconnected from what they were doing day in and day out in school. So one of the goals of the redesigned SAT, which went into effect into 2016, was to try to make that test more accessible to students. More of a curriculum-based test, more in line with what they were doing day in and day out in school. It is still the College Board though, it is still the SAT. It still has what I call SAT-ness to it. There is still that power component. There is still a little bit of that element of misdirection on it, but not to that extent of that SAT that kind of we all knew and loved. The ACT, by comparison, it was developed in the 1950s. It was developed to be in direct competition with the SAT, and because the SAT historically always more of an aptitude test, more of a power test, to compete against that, ACT's always been more of a curriculum-based test. Questions always a little bit more straightforward, which is why, especially in the Northeast, the ACT has the reputation of being, quote, an easier test. But it's not easier. The difficulty on that ACT comes from the speed of it, comes from the pace of it. It's a total sprint from start to finish on that test. So often students who take an ACT for the first time, often they'll walk out of there and be like, Drew, I didn't think it was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it, but that's where that difficulty comes from. Generally speaking, students feel rushed. Generally speaking, they feel like they don't have the time that they need to really be able to hit their full potential on that test. So here's the side-by-side comparison of the tests. You can see they're both pretty long. 3 hours, 50 minutes if students write that optional SAT essay at the end. 3 hours, 35 minutes on the ACT again if students include that optional writing portion at the end of those tests. So I'll circle back to the essay in terms of whether or not students need to write this. Those essay scores, they're total standalone scores, so they're not factored into the total score or that ACT composite score, but we'll come back in terms of my recommendations around that. But you can see the test, a lot of overlap in terms of their content, and most students, when they look at this slide, they usually, I say anywhere between 30 minutes to a minute, they usually look at this and they're like, Drew, this is going to be the easiest decision I have to make around this whole college admission process. I know exactly which test I'm going to take, and I'm going to take the ACT. And the reason why they come to that conclusion and come to that conclusion so quickly is they look here. They see the SAT 65-minute reading section and they compare that to the ACT 35-minute reading section and they go 65-minute reading versus 35-minute reading. This is a no-brainer. I'm going to go here. But here's the rub on that 35-minute reading ACT section. It's 35 minutes, it's 40 questions, it's 4 passages, 10 questions per passage. So that breaks down to 8.5 minutes per passage and 10 questions per passage, which breaks down further to 4 to 4.5 minutes for students to read a pretty lengthy passage, and they can't just skim it. They actually have to read it for understanding. And that gives them 4 to 4.5 minutes to answer 10 questions. And they gotta keep that pace up for that full 35 minutes. Not an easy thing to do. The writing and language and English portions of the test, these are the 2 sections that are most similar. This is the grammar portion, where students are given various passages and asked to correct the grammatical errors as they go through it, or kind of like a peer editing assignment. You can see on the SATs, there is that no calculator math section. They're not trying to torment students by taking their calculator away. I'm as guilty as anyone in today's day and age. I am totally calculator dependent. But what they're trying to test there is, do students actually understand the math behind the math? Not just, are they grabbing a calculator, putting in numbers, really having no understanding of what they're doing, and finding an answer. And then students get their calculator back for that second math section there. And then ACT, again, a little bit more student friendly. Students are allowed their calculator throughout. But the difficulty comes from the pace of it. Again, 60 minutes, 60 questions, it's about 1 minute per question. Which then brings us to the science section on that ACT. It's not real science in terms of what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. More deductive reasoning and logic. Can students work their way through a scientific passage of which they might not know anything about? Use the scientific method to kind of guide them. And then the idea of it is, as they answer those questions that are associated with that particular passage, they'll have a better understanding, having worked through those questions, of what that science passage was actually about. And keep in mind my background when I talk about this, because I'm totally biased when I talk about this. But you can see on the SAT, there's no separate science section. It's a little bit forced on the SAT, the way in which they're going to try to incorporate science. According to the College Board, students are demonstrating their understanding of science if they can interpret a table. I might argue there might be a little bit more involved to science than just reading a table. But even though we're in a reading section or the grammar section, there's going to be what they call these data graphics. Students are going to be asked to interpret data as they're working through this test. And then real quickly on the scoring of it, just to orient us. So that SAT, 200 to 800 on what they call evidence-based reading and writing, that combined reading and grammar section score, that's a mouthful. I'm just going to call it verbal. So 200 to 800 on verbal, and then 200 to 800 on math. So that SAT is back to that 400 to 1600 point scale that we all kind of knew and loved back in the day. The ACT, if you're not familiar with the ACT, it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's on a 1 through 36 scale. And what colleges care about is the overall composite score. And that composite score is just the average. So they're going to take a student's English, math, reading, science scores, add them all up, divide by 4. They do round up, so 29.5 is going to round up to a 30. And just to orient you, with 30 on the ACT out of 36, it's the equivalent of about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. And again, that optional essay, total standalone score, not factored into either of those scales. So just to give you a sense in terms of how this power versus speed plays out on these tests, I'll just do a quick side-by-side comparison of questions just so you get a feel for it. I'm not going to call on anyone. We don't actually going to work through these. Again, it's more just to give you a feel for it. So back in my day, we had like a fountain pen and we learned like total formal grammar. In today's day and age, we all communicate like this. So both the SAT and the ACT, they just want to make sure that students understand basic English grammar. So questions that look like this. Number 8 is just verb tense. Number 9 is punctuation. Do students understand the correct usage of a colon or a semicolon? And SAT looks almost identical to this, their grammar portion of that test. Here's what it looks like on the SAT. You can see very, very similar. Again, this is the data graphics. This is the SAT asking students to demonstrate their understanding of science. They're going to have to read this table. And again, where the power component comes in on the SAT, in addition to having students read this table, they're also going to have to show or answer a question in terms of how this table supports that main idea or that central argument that author was trying to make in that passage. And I flipped through this quickly, so I'll just flip back, but you can kind of get the sense on that ACT. The reading's just a little bit easier, more in line with maybe what a typical high school student might write, whereas that SAT reading just harder, denser, a little bit more academic language on that SAT reading. And then brings us to the reading, and sometimes we've already covered this. To truly understand the differences between the SAT and ACT reading sections, it comes down to that difference in timing. So that SAT section, 65 minutes, 5 passages, so 13 minutes per passage, whereas on that ACT, 35 minutes, 4 passages, 8.5 minutes per passage. In the world of standardized testing, there's just a huge difference between having 13 minutes on a passage and 8.5 minutes on a passage. So just by knowing that, you can probably guess that SAT is going to require students to do a closer reading, a deeper reading, a more analytical reading, a more inferential reading. So more questions along these lines. What can reasonably be inferred? And then back to that command of evidence subscores. For some of these questions, there's going to be follow-up questions that look like this. Which choice provides the best evidence? There's actually going to be line numbers in these answer choices. Again, forcing students to go back and do a closer reading, almost a line-by-line reading. Whereas on the ACT, they really don't have time for that. More questions along these lines, the passage points to this. In that short amount of time, can students show that they read and understood the passage, they understood the central argument that that author was trying to make? Which then brings us to the math, everybody's favorite topic around this. These are both along slope of the line, but again, I just choose these, again, just to highlight that difference between power versus speed. And I'll just read this, just so you can hear it. This is the way the SAT asks it. The graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a0 and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? And most students have the same reaction that we all have, especially when I read it like that, which is, what? I have no idea what that is even asking. So the College Board, they could have asked this in a much more straightforward way. They could have asked this in a more accessible way. They could have asked this as the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0, 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And if they worded it that way, most students would recognize that question and be like, oh, it's just asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I know exactly how to do that. But this is where the power comes in. This is where the misdirection comes in. For students to really understand that this is just asking them to find the slope of the line between 2 points, they got to figure out that whole a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, and figure out how that relates back to that earlier part of the question. Where again, ACT, more of a speed test, just less interested in kind of playing that misdirection game. Much more straightforward of a question. Students are given lines with slopes. One of the lines has a slope of 3. They're asked for the perpendicular line. They're either going to remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes, or they're not. If they do remember it, they know that answer is C, -1/3. If they don't remember it, they're choosing their favorite ACT letter and moving on to that next question. There's nothing to figure out here, right? There's no getting inside the test taker's head. There's no real kind of logicking your way to the answer here. Again, that difference between speed versus power. On that speed, you either know it or you don't. Instant recognition, circle that answer, move on to that next question quickly. Also on the SAT, just huge emphasis on Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. So 60 to 70% of the math on that SAT is algebra. Obviously, if they emphasize something, they need to de-emphasize something. What they de-emphasize was geometry. So geometry is less than 10% of the math on that SAT. Again, that no calculator section, just testing students' math fluency. Do they actually know the math behind the math? Whereas ACT, Just more topics covered. Only 30% is algebra, way more geometry on that ACT compared to what's on that SAT. Calculators allowed throughout, but again, it's a sprint. It's a total race from start to finish on that ACT math section. Which then brings us to that ACT science. It is designed to overwhelm students and kind of take their breaths away. Oftentimes students who see the ACT science section for the first time, their reaction is usually something like, Drew, there is no way. There is no way in 35 minutes I'm going to be able to answer 40 questions and work my way through 6 or 7 passages that have tables or figures that look like this. And to give you a sense of this, this is actually cut off. The entire figure didn't actually fit on the slide. It continues all the way down here. It's actually not as bad as it first seems. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I don't need to know any of that in order to be able to answer this question. What I do need to be able to do is obviously read the question. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core, well, I have to find figure 1. It has to be this, because it's the only thing on the slide. And then outer core is here, and I know how to read a graph, so I know I'm on the y-axis here, so I know I'm between these 2 dashed lines, so I know I'm between these 2 points, so I know that answer choice is C, 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I have found. I have no idea what that answer means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students struggle with the ACT and can struggle in particular with that ACT science section. Because it's such a fast-paced test, and again, they're working at a pace that's generally faster than what they're comfortable with, the ACT has the tendency to turn on everybody's self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes something like this. Drew, you did this awfully quickly. Are you sure that answer choice is C? And if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this, or triple check this, or quadruple check this. But on that ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving students just some strategies and approach to that science section, it's also just building their confidence up that they can see a question like this, circle answer choice C, and without any hesitation or doubt, move on to that next question. Which then brings us to the essay. And at this point, most students are feeling kind of like this. Gets even worse when they read that SAT essay prompt. So that SAT essay prompt, what it's going to ask students to do is students are given, it's roughly, I think, a 600 to 700 word argument. And students aren't asked whether they agree or disagree with the author's point of view, but rather what rhetorical devices did that author use, and was she successful in the use of those devices. So you can just imagine, again, a national test, students going in cold, have never been exposed to rhetorical analysis writing, have no idea this essay is coming. The College Board is just going to get thousands of essays that are like, yeah, I thought the author was convincing because before I read her argument I wasn't convinced, and now I'm convinced. And then look at the clock and be like, oh my gosh, I have 40 more minutes? Like, what on earth am I going to write about for 40 minutes? It's pretty formulaic. They're looking for things like the author's use of symbolic language, so simile and metaphor, the author's appeal to emotion, the author's citing an authority, the author's use of exaggeration. So for any rhetoric majors in the room, you might recognize that as Aristotle's triangle of rhetoric, things like ethos and pathos. I always tell my students, if you want to show off and can use those terms correctly, by all means sprinkle them in throughout your essay, but the College Board readers, they're not actually looking for students to use those terms, but if they want to, they can. ACT essay, again, a little bit more student-friendly. It's generally a topic around something current event-ish, like should genetically modified foods be banned, yes or no? And then they are looking for an opinionated, or they are looking for an argumentative essay from the student. They want the student's clear point of view on this. Yes, GMO foods should be banned. No, GMO food should not be banned. And then students are going to be given 3 different perspectives and asked to incorporate those perspectives throughout their essay. So then the question is always, all right, Drew, so do we need this, right? It's optional. It's a total standalone score. We're down to less than 20 colleges that are requiring it. There's another 30 that recommend. Generally for our students, recommend means required. But just standing up here, not knowing what your college lists are going to be, as the ultimate hedge, we tell students that when they take either the SAT or the ACT, to write the essay at least once. That way they have it if they need it, because we're just trying to avoid the situation where fall of senior year, a student adds a college to their list, They realize that that college requires or recommends this essay and they haven't taken it, and now maybe they're scrambling to take these tests one more time just for the sake of writing this essay. For those colleges that are requiring it and recommending it, not clear what they're using that essay score for. They're putting little to no weight on that essay score, but there are colleges out there that want to see it. Again, not clear why. So that's where that recommendation comes from. Really just a hedge kind of on our part. So there are some similarities between these tests. The SAT, it's down to 4 answer choices instead of 5. ACT, also all sections only have 4 answer choices instead of 5, with the exception of ACT Math, which still has 5 answer choices on it. Both tests do not have a guessing penalty. It's what they call rights-only scoring. So students do not get penalized a quarter of a point for wrong answers. So they should not leave anything blank on either of these tests. So on the SAT, if they have no idea what that question is asking, they should just choose their favorite SAT letter and move on to that next question. Similarly on the ACT, if they've run out of time on a section, just choose your favorite ACT letter and bubble it all the way down. Those grammar portions of the tests are almost identical to one another. Again, both tests more curriculum-based tests, less aptitude tests. Again, on that SAT, a little bit forced, but that incorporation of science. And again, a lot of overlap between on the content that's covered between these tests. So, but there are some differences, obviously, in terms of that power versus speed. So SAT, generally speaking, harder reading, slightly more challenging questions, requires a deeper understanding of concepts, and narrower focus of skills, especially on the math, with that emphasis on algebra. And again, power test, more time per question. Whereas ACT questions, again, a little bit more straightforward, but does require instant recognition, as we saw with that slope of the line on that ACT math question. Broader scope of skills, especially on that math, more math topics covered. And again, the difficulty comes from the pace of it, just a total sprint from start to finish. Which then brings me to kind of the million-dollar question, which is, all right, Drew, so which test, right? Should we focus SAT? Should we focus ACT? And I put this cartoon up there just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student's going to prefer the SAT, this type of student's going to prefer the ACT. But really, at the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to try both, ideally in a practice test setting, and then using that concordance table to be able to compare scores. Keep in mind, 70 to 80% of students are going to score equally well on both tests, which is always kind of reassuring. They're supposed to be college admissions tests. Hopefully they're measuring similar things, so you would want students to perform comparably well on them. There is about, again, 20 to 25% of students who are going to have a clear scoring preference for one or the other. So for those students who are falling into that camp, which is most students, where those scores are identical, we always tell students and families, don't overthink this. Kind of go with their gut instinct. We joke, which test did you hate the least? Which one do you think plays to your strength? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which one do you think you're going to have an easier time of raising that score on? And regardless of whether you go down an SAT path or an ACT path, really those scores are going to end up being in the same place. It's really just kind of a student's preference as to which path they might go down. So I always encourage students and families, try not to get hung up on this. Sometimes families, they just spin their wheels a little bit when those scores come back similarly. They're like, oh my gosh, there's the perfect test, right? Which one? Are we going to do SAT? Are we going to do ACT? Just really don't overthink it. Go with the student's gut instinct and go down that path. So here's the concordance table. I know this is a little bit small. It is in the testing guide that you have, but again, just to orient us, I choose ACT score of 24. That's the state average here in Massachusetts. That's the equivalent of 1180, and again, that 30 on the ACT out of 36. Composite score, that's the equivalent of 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. Real quickly on subject tests. So for those of us, you might know them better as achievement tests. They've also been called SAT-2s. These are just hour-long content area specific tests, and they're all multiple choice. They're offered in these various areas. They are on the way out, but they have not been completely eliminated from the standardized testing landscape. The vast, vast, vast majority of students are not going to need subject tests as part of their testing plan. It is really only the most selective schools that are still looking for subject tests. And here they are. So that we are down to 3 colleges nationally, that's it, that require them. Here they are, probably no surprise. So it's California Institute of Technology, it's Harvey Mudd College, it's Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Where the subject tests always seem to cause angst is this slide. There are 13 colleges out there that, quote, recommend. What does that mean? Generally speaking, again, for our students, recommend means required. But if you are thinking of having these particular schools on your list, just keep in mind you might need subject tests as part of that landscape. For these colleges that require or recommend, they only need 2 subject tests. So they only need 2 in any of these areas. The exception to this is Georgetown, which still requires 3. Generally, they do not care which subject tests you end up sending. For the MITs of the world, the 2 that they want a math, so either a math level 1 or 2, and they want a science. But for these schools here, when you're applying to just sort of the liberal College of Arts and Sciences, they don't care which 2 you end up sending.
The slide's not the same as what we have in our plan.
Oh, so... So it might be this. Okay, sorry. So this is required for all applicants. This is, quote, recommended, which again for our students generally means required. And then there are some colleges out there where, depending on the program in which you're applying to, there might be a subject test requirement. And the most common one here is the School of Engineering. So if you're applying for a School of Engineering, again, oftentimes they might require a math or a science one. But again, the vast majority of students, they're not going to need subject tests as part of that testing plan. It's really only those most selective schools, or sometimes some very, very specific programs within colleges or universities that are going to be still looking for subject tests. The other quick point on subject tests, they have not been redesigned. There is still 5 answer choices. There is still a guessing penalty. So for students, we generally recommend that they don't randomly guess on the subject test. If they have no idea what that question is asking, to just skip it. Also, this is also maddening for families and for students. Those colleges that require or recommend subject tests, they will not take AP scores in lieu of those subject test scores. So think of it in terms of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. If a student's in AP chemistry and they took the AP exam and they got a 5 on it, obviously they're going to send that score to that college. But that college that requires subject tests, they're not going to take that AP score in lieu of it. They're going to want to see that subject test score as well. So again, all that work that students are doing to prep for that AP test, it's going to help on that subject test. So again, just think of it as kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone there. And then just in terms of when to take these. So I've already kind of covered this. Again, performance on these tests correlates with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So the later students take these tests, generally the better they're going to perform. Our recommendation, again, late spring junior year, fall of senior year. But you can see all the test dates that are offered. So especially for the juniors in the room, as we kind of head into the standardized testing season, you can see we have a February ACT, then we have a March SAT, then we have an April ACT, then we have a May SAT, then we have a June SAT and a June ACT, and hey, they've added summer testing now. Isn't that exciting? And then fall of senior year, rinse, lather, repeat on that. Please, 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 please do not do that. No one wants these students taking these tests 6, 7, 8 times. There's no need for it. Most students aren't one and done just because they're always a little bit nervous the first time they take it. But generally speaking, most students are going to hit their peak scores after taking it 2 times, 3 times, depending on when they started, maybe a 4th time the fall of senior year. Students have a lot going on. Again, we know that colleges care most about their day in and day out performance in school. So please, as you're thinking about that testing plan, something that's sensible, right? That's going to work with the student's schedule, that doesn't necessarily emphasize early and often testing. Just keep testing, 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 and start earlier, earlier, and earlier. The other general, and again, there's always exceptions to this, the other general recommendation around this. We know that the SAT and the ACT are accepted by colleges equally well, so there is no need for students to end up taking both tests. So the other thing we're trying to avoid is just ping-ponging between tests like February ACT to March SAT to April ACT to May SAT. Just way more efficient if you can kind of pick one, stick with that one, give it a chance to work, knowing that, for instance, at the end of junior year, for whatever reason, you feel like that score is not reflective of what your student is capable of, you feel like you kind of maxed out on one test, all that work that you may have done on one test, it's going to help with that other test. And again, there's always exceptions to this, but that's just sort of our general guidelines as you're thinking about that standardized testing plan. And just to kind of give you a sense in terms of the day and age in which we live, so the ACT, they actually did set a limit in terms of the number of tests that students can take. So they had a girl somewhere in this country who tried to register for an ACT for the 14th time, and the ACT said no. So why it took them 14 times to cut her off, I do not know. But again, generally speaking, students are going to be taking this 2-3 times. After that, you start running into that law of diminishing returns. Scores do plateau, so really it's just trying to come up with something sensible there. So just, again, some general guidelines on this for sophomores in the room. Generally speaking, too early to start now, right? 10th grade, we want to focus on curriculum, we want to focus on extracurricular activities, not worrying about the testing piece just yet. But our general recommendation is after sophomore year, if you want to kind of get a jump on it, you, again, take advantage of our free proctored practice tests that we run in our Newton office. They can try a practice SAT, try a practice ACT. Doesn't mean we're going to start prep over that summer after sophomore year, but it just means you might have a better sense in terms of the scores and also whether or not you're going to focus on SAT or ACT. So junior year, again, this is probably our most typical plan. Taking an SAT twice in late spring of junior year or twice in on the ACT spring of junior year, and then you can see senior year final SAT or ACT as needed. And we do have a lot of students who actually hit their full peak or hit their peak in that fall of senior year. So our goal is generally to try to be done with testing at the end of junior year, but again, don't panic. You're not behind if your student feels like they want to try it one more time in that fall of senior year. So visually, here's what it looks like. Again, please don't do this, but students can take these tests every single month from sophomore year on, with the exception of January. Again, the whole idea of that testing plan is to take these dates and come up with something sensible that's going to work for you. So here's Caden, just to give you a feel for this. He did his diagnostic testing after sophomore in the summer. And again, for juniors in the room, you're not behind if you haven't done this. We have a PSAT score, which you can use as your baseline score. Again, if you want your student to just get some exposure to try or practice ACT, again, you can do that with us. You'll have a PSAT score, you'll have that ACT score and that experience of taking the ACT, and now you're kind of off and running in terms of mapping out, are you going to go SAT or ACT? So again, you're not behind in any way, shape, or form. But here's Caden. Performed equally well in the SAT and ACT in the practice setting. Had a slight preference for the SAT, so did that PSAT in October, and then we kind of came up with March and May. He was in some AP courses and looking at some of those most selective schools, so we did want to have subject tests as part of that plan. Also, in terms of subject tests, you can't take the SAT and subject tests on the same day. Not that you would want to. It would be like 7 hours of testing. But again, just to keep that on your radar if you're going to need subject tests. And pretty typical, Caden just felt like he hadn't reached his full potential on it, that score wasn't truly reflective of what we was capable of. So we tried it one more time in August of senior year. And again, there's many, many different paths to this. This is just kind of one example. And then just real quickly, as we finish up here, in terms of score choice and super scoring, just want to make sure you're familiar with these terms. So almost all colleges honor what they call score choice, which means your students control what scores they send to colleges. So if they took an SAT for the first time, let's say they took it a little bit early and it didn't go so well, they can decide not to send that score to colleges. There are some schools out there, it's a very, very small number of schools. I think we're over 97% of colleges honor score choice. There are some schools out there that do want to see all scores. Not entirely clear why they want to see all scores. It's partly they're trying to get in front of that serial testing. So that student who's like, Drew, I totally hear you and I totally get it, but I don't care. I'm going to take this thing 12 times and group my way through it. It's just with these colleges telling students that they're going to have to send all scores, hopefully it's just kind of slowing that roll a little bit, maybe getting students to reconsider that. The other reason why these colleges want to see all scores, it's because they are in fact super scoring. So what super scoring means is if students have taken the test more than once, they're going to send the full score reports, but what colleges are going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores from those different sittings of that test and build what I call a Frankenstein score. So even though this student did not get a 1290 in that one sitting, this is the student's SAT score. So back in my day, it was a folder. They used to write, imagine that, with a pencil on a folder, and they would write 640 and 650. And there's always a little bit of questions around this. Like, all right, Drew, for those schools that are super scoring, are they really super scoring? Or do they just want to, quote, trick me into sending all scores so that I'll see this 580 and maybe I'll think, oh, the student really got a 580. Or maybe they'll start averaging these two scores. Those schools that are super scoring, they are not playing gotcha here. They are, in fact, super scoring. They are going to write down 640, 650, no questions asked. That is that student's score. And again, to reassure you, college admission folk, they do not have time to go through every single set of scores. So the software in that admissions office, this process is actually automated. So for those schools that super score, that software just cherry picks these scores. That's the only score that college admissions officer sees. Couple reasons as to why colleges are super scoring. This is my favorite joke, so you have to bear with me. So they're called college admissions officers, not college rejection officers. They're looking for reasons to accept students. They're evaluating these applications in the most positive light possible. So super scoring is a way to look at that standardized testing again in that best light. And it's also a recognition that this score is a much truer picture, a much better reflection of what that student is capable of. That student did not get that 650 or 640 by some kind of chance or by fluke. This is probably more indicative of their academic ability. Also, it is in the college's best interest to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can. We all kind of loathe the US News and World Report rankings, but standardized testing is still part of that. Even things that you wouldn't even think of, like a college's bond rating, can be impacted by their published SAT and ACT scores. So super scoring is a way that they can publish as high SAT and ACT as they can. So that's what it looks like on the SAT. ACT, very similar. Again, student took it 3 times. Here's the various subsection scores. Those schools that super score the ACT, again, very similar. They're going to choose that highest English, math, reading, science subsection scores, and then they're going to recalculate that composite score. So even though that student did not get a 31 in a single sitting, for super scoring purposes, again, these are the ACT scores those college admission officers are going to see. We're over, I think, more than 95% of colleges are super scoring the SAT now. We're over 60% now. I think we might be approaching 70% of colleges are super scoring the ACT. Colleges are very upfront in terms of their testing policies, whether they honor score choice, whether they super score SAT, ACT, or both. Usually you can find that info on their website, but you can also just call them, ideally your student call them, if you have any questions in terms of how they're using that score. The other reason why I want to cover super score is one, just so you're aware of it and you know what that term means. But the other reason why I want to cover super scoring, again, it's back to that PSAT score. And again, keeping that PSAT score in context and not getting hung up on that high level PSAT score. So it's kind of everybody's instinct, and I totally get it. You get the PSAT score, especially if you're junior, and you might start thinking about colleges that you have in mind, and then our guide has it, but you can also find it on the web. You just kind of look and you're like, oh, we're kind of interested in this college. What's their published SAT scores? And then you compare the published SAT scores to the PSAT scores, and maybe those PSAT scores are coming in a little bit lower than what you were hoping, and suddenly you start hitting the panic button. You're like, oh my gosh, like we gotta move on this like tomorrow. Just remember, right, it is not an apples to apples comparison when you're comparing those. Over 95% of colleges are super scoring their SAT, right? So that published SAT score is a super score from admitted seniors who have probably taken this test 2, 3, 4 times, where they have cherry-picked the highest subsection scores. And you're taking that score and you are comparing it to an October PSAT score. Again, students taking it a little bit early, and chances are, and hopefully they just went in there and took that cold. So again, if you get that PSAT score and it came in a little bit lower, please don't start hitting the panic button. Please don't start using that PSAT score to start formulating lists. Where students start on this and where they end on this, especially with super scoring, is going to be 2 totally different places in terms of those scores. And then just real quickly, in terms of how to prepare for these, like anything, as students are hitting their peak in practice is when we want them to hit those, to go in and take the test. So generally, any type of prep that a student does, we just want that student to have that prep lead up to a test. Generally, you're looking at about 6 to 15 weeks ahead of time. Again, we're trying to do something sensible. We don't want it to drag on for forever there. And again, the length of time is really going to come down to the student's baseline score and kind of their goal. And then just real quickly in terms of what goes into prep. So 3 major areas. One is content, just so students know what's on the test, so know all the math that's on it, know all the verbal rules that are, or the grammar rules that are covered. The other strategy, just having a game plan for it for every question in every section. And then that best form of practice for students is practice, practice, practice on official release tests. So the College Board, in partnership with Khan Academy, there's now 8 official SAT tests out there, which you can download for free. You can also get them from the College Board website. ACT has something similar. I think it's the official guide to the ACT. It's the red book. You can buy 4 practice tests, and then there's another 4 or 5 ACT tests also that you can get online. And you can get explanations for them. You can also get the scales for them, also the right and wrong answers, obviously, for them. But the real benefit of those practice tests, it's not just brute force practice tests after practice tests after practice tests after practice tests. Yay, my score went up, boo, it went down, yay, it went back up again. But students, obviously, in addition to looking at the questions that they missed, right, knowing why their answer was wrong, why the right answer was right, but really doing a deeper dive and looking at those questions that they missed and understanding what led them to that wrong answer. That is how they're going to improve their score, not just practice test after practice test after practice test on this. It's not that, oh my gosh, I'm taking the SAT in 2 weeks, I got 8 practice tests. Here we go. I'm going to now do testing for the next 24 hours, right? Try to space it out, give students a chance to kind of internalize some of those strategies and content that they're learning. So again, I know I hit you with a ton, but just to wrap up what we've covered this morning, most students are going to score the same, regardless of whether they go on that SAT or ACT practice test or PSAT. It is just worth exploring to see if a student falls in that 20 percentile where they're going to have a scoring preference for one or the other, but really it's more getting a feeling for their gut instinct. They're accepted both, so think about it in terms of taking the potential amount of work and cutting it in half, right? Why prep for both tests when we know we can just pick one and focus on that one? And again, there is so much overlap in the content between the 2 tests that any work that students do with one is going to help with that other. So again, at the end of junior year, if they just feel like they've maxed out and feel like that score is not reflective of who they are, if they decide to switch tests, any work that they've done for one is going to help with that other. And again, I know I've hit you ad nauseum with this, but I know there's huge pressures out there for just keep testing, 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 and start earlier, earlier, and earlier. But again, statistically speaking, because they're both tests are curriculum-based tests, students, again, they're going to perform better the more time they've had in school and just a little bit older they are. So late spring of junior year, fall of senior year is when students statistically peak on this. And I just leave you with this. We know that the most important thing that colleges are looking at is the students' grades and their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. So a good testing plan, you just have to prioritize academics over any kind of test prep. It doesn't do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say up here, but really at the end of the day, it is just a test, right? It is not the be-all of this whole admission process. For those of you going through this for the first time, I encourage you, try to have some fun with this if you can. Think about it as being like the ultimate family bonding experience. When else are you going to be able to go on a 14-hour road trip with your entire family? If there's younger siblings, you have to put them in the car and drag them along as well. At some point, you lose cell phone service, so you get to talk to one another. That's kind of exciting. And again, you know, the college, the guidance office here is fantastic. They have a lot of experience in terms of helping students at various abilities through this process. You are in fantastic hands with them. But just keep in mind, really at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're just trying to get this list down to something reasonable, knowing that regardless any one of those schools that ends up on that list, your student's going to thrive academically, they're going to thrive socially, they're going to thrive extracurricularly, because this is really just all about fit, right? Where is my student going to thrive? Where are they going to be happiest over those next 4 years? And thanks again for everybody for hanging in there. Again, we're based out of Newton. We do one-on-one in-home as well, so if you're looking for a little bit of additional support on this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And then lastly, again, you have the schedule for our upcoming free proctored practice tests. Please take advantage of those. And it's just through February, but we run them year-round. We run them Saturdays, Sundays. We pretty much run them 52 weekends a year. So again, just call us a week or two in advance, and we'll make sure that you get registered for those. All right, thanks everybody for hanging in there. I know it was a lot of information. And then what we'll do is, for people who need to leave, we'll let people leave, and then we'll do questions as a group, because that way I can repeat them, and that way everyone can benefit from answers to those. So thank you everybody for coming. For those of you who need to leave, and then I have the mic, so I can probably talk over people. Does anyone want to start us off? Okay, yes.
Can I ask about international schools? Do they accept SATs and ACTs?
Okay, so the question is around international schools in terms of whether they accept SAT and ACT and whether they accept them equally. So it's not my area of expertise, so really what I would recommend is that you check with the school, because it might, to my understanding, most colleges are going to accept either the SAT or ACT internationally, but I do feel like there's some exceptions to that. And then, yes, Sharon, I was going to call on you. Sharon, you want to take that?
Because that's my area, the college abroad. For the most part, they will accept. There are some that want the SAT. And the way it was explained to me is kind of like a Celsius Fahrenheit thing, where they may, the SAT is their preference, and they can convert the ACT if they need to, but it will be simple.
Sharon, thank you. Yeah. We'll go for the.
For Southwest
Yep.
where they get SAT.
Yep. Yep.
How do you get accommodations for the ACT?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that. The questions are around accommodations. So for students who are on IEPs, can you get accommodations? And the answer is yes. So for both the SAT and the ACT, they do grant accommodations. They are looking for the IEP. They are also looking for some kind of neuropsych or diagnosis on file. They're also looking, they're going to ask you whether the student is using those accommodations during the school day or at school. And for both the SAT and ACT, if you can check those boxes, generally speaking, those students are going to get accommodations for the SAT and ACT. The one thing to keep in mind, right, SAT, ACT, think of it as Coke versus Pepsi. It's two totally separate organizations. You have to apply to each one to get those accommodations. So just because you have it for the SAT, and this may have happened automatically because the school got it for you for the PSAT, it doesn't mean you have it on the ACT. There's a formal application process which the school will guide you through and help you with, because there's paperwork that the school needs to send in. But yes, you can absolutely get extended time and accommodations on that ACT as well.
Yeah, so I would say talk to your child's either resource teacher or school counselor, and they can guide you on how to get those accommodations.
Yep, way in the back.
Are the open period of time between early spring and
Yeah, so the question is in terms around just difficulty of the test, I'll expand the question a little bit, is there kind of a better time to take these tests? There's tons of urban legend around that you know, you want to take this test as opposed to this test. That is total 100% urban legend. Students are actually normed. They're not normed against the students sitting for that test. They are normed against a consistent cohort group, and that cohort group, all those students that take those various tests, they're normed against that same cohort group. So in terms of the difficulty of the test, they try to make sure that the test is consistent from test to test in terms of its difficulty, and in terms of the scaling and the norming of that test, it does not matter which test date you end up taking. So in terms of that testing plan, don't worry about that. It's more in terms of when's the best time for your student to take that test. Yep.
Do colleges give a certain weight to SAT scores versus the essay scores?
Sorry, say that again.
Is there a certain weightage assigned to the regular SAT score versus the essay score?
Oh, so yeah. So the question is around. Is there a certain weight around sort of that SAT score compared to that SAT essay score? That's that optional. So the answer is really they're not looking at that essay score at all. It's scored totally differently than the SAT than the other portions of that test. Just in the interest of time, I won't do a deep wonkish dive in terms of how this is scored. But that ACT essay, it's on a 2 through 12 scale. So students will get like a score of 8, 9, 7. And again, colleges, it's not clear what they're doing with it. And then on that SAT scoring, the scoring is even more complicated than that. It's 3 different scores: reading, writing, how well is it written, and then analysis, did they write a rhetorical analysis essay? And those scores are 2 out of 8. So students will get scores like 7, 7, 6. And like 5, 5, 4. And the college board, it's out of 24 on that essay, but to give you a sense of this, the college board is not even adding those scores up. Literally the colleges are getting scores like 6, 5, 6, and then really what the college board is telling colleges is like, here's the scores, come back to us in like 3 or 4 years, and you tell us if this is helpful at all. So again, even those colleges that require it or recommend it, they're not putting really any weight on those essay scores. So we generally tell students, don't retake these tests just in the hopes of maybe improving an essay score. It's not going to move that needle kind of one way or the other on that. But if you have questions around that, you can call us. Yeah?
So thinking about the super scoring, do
Yeah.
you ever recommend that a child focuses on one part of the test or the other?
Yeah, so the question is around super scoring. So we know most schools are super scoring. You know, just as a strategy and game plan going into that test, do we tell students, you know, sometimes maybe put a little emphasis on one than the other? So what I'll tell students is, I don't want them to completely game it, right? So I don't want them to be like, okay, I'm concentrating on, you know, for instance, I'm concentrating on math this time, and I don't want to burn myself out on the verbal, so I'm just going to sit there and randomly guess on the verbal, and then get a score of like 340 on the verbal, and then my math score is like a 750, and then I'm going to switch it the next time and go like 750, and now, hey, I'm done, I'm already locked in, so A, B, C. But having said that, yes, there's definitely, again, depending on the student, their goal, where they are, you know, certainly I've told students, like, look, you've locked in a verbal score, right? Still want you to try, but make sure you leave something in the tank for that math. Again, not in a gaming way. Like, I don't want students to be doing that. I still want them to try on it. But yeah, you know, oftentimes I'll have students go into that first test and be like, look, even if you can just nail one of the sections on this, like, that's fantastic. It will take some of the pressure off that second time. And the reason why we pair tests in terms of sort of that late spring, why I recommend doing it twice, it's really just to take the pressure off students, so that they know they have another test. So if they're going into March SAT, they know they have May. If they're going into May, they know they have August if they need it. So everything to win, nothing to lose on that test is the mentality I want them to have. And certainly super scoring plays into that a little bit. To be like, look, if you did the verbal on the SAT and it didn't go so well, don't worry. Like, don't let that throw you off your game. Just kind of take that break, refocus, devote that energy to that verbal. It's I channel my inner Bill Belichick. I'm like, one question at a time, one section at a time, don't get thrown off by what came earlier. Yeah?
I have a follow-up question. These are still paper tests?
Yes, so it's still paper and pencil tests.
So there's no algorithm like there is like...
No, it's not an adaptive test. So the question, it's not, students are not taking this on a computer and the questions don't get easier or harder depending on how they did. It's all paper and pencil. Every single question is worth the same. The one exception to that is ACT internationally. It is an online test. Again, not adaptive though. So if students end up taking, the test outside of this country for the ACT, they're going to be in front of a computer when they take it. But again, it's not adaptive. Yep.
Can you talk something about AP tests as compared to the subject test?
Yeah, so the question is around AP tests compared to the subject test. So AP, it stands for Advanced Placement. The idea of that course is that it's a college level course. So the exam, it's testing college level material. Whereas subject tests are geared towards high school curriculum, geared towards a course that a student's taken in high school. Having said that, obviously if a student's done, for instance, 2 years of chemistry, say intro chemistry, and then advanced placement chemistry, we generally recommend that if they know they're going to do that, that students wait until after they've taken the AP course, that second year of chemistry before they take that subject test. But if students are in a non-AP course and decide to do a subject test, just know it's designed for a standard kind of high school curriculum around that test. So you don't necessarily have to do an AP course in order to be prepared for one of these tests. And that's kind of where that discrepancy lies in terms of why those schools that require subject tests, they want to see subject tests and not AP scores, because they want to measure in terms of how well did you do on this content on a high school level, not necessarily on a college level. So that's why they're not taking that score other than that.
That means the college looks more on the high school levels rather than you jump up to the...
Yeah, so the question is kind of like, okay, so you have AP scores and you have subject test scores, right? Which one is the college kind of looking at? It's going to depend on the college. Like every admission team has kind of their own sort of lens in which they look through this, but they're going to consider both. I mean, they'll still consider those AP scores. They'll look at them. On that NACAC survey, you'll see it's like 38% now of colleges are looking at AP scores and putting moderate or considerable weight on them. So they'll certainly see it. But again, it's hard to say in terms of for each college in terms of the weight that they're going to put on AP versus subject tests. I'm more speaking in terms of just making sure your application is complete, that if they require subject tests or recommend subject tests, even though you have APs, you just want to make sure that you have subject test scores as well in addition to that. Yep. I'll try to work this way and move it around.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. First is, do you have similar information about APs if we're unfamiliar with that landscape?
Yeah, so there is in the college admissions guide, you'll see there's some resources devoted in terms to explaining what APs are and how they're scored and things, so there's some information on that.
And second question for LHS actually, are our students receiving similar information or overview about these tests?
Yeah, they do get a little bit of overview in junior seminar and senior seminar. So, yes, but we are thinking about ways to provide more in-depth information to students as well. So that is something that but they do get it in their seminars.
Okay.
Yep, way in the back.
If your students need to practice ACT or SAT or both of them the summer before the fall of junior year,
Yeah.
do they need to take the PSATs in the fall of junior year?
So generally, so the question is if students say, for instance, do a practice SAT and a full-length practice SAT and the ACT over the summer, do they then need to take the PSAT, as a junior in October of junior year? And I would say it's kind of a personal decision on that. Anytime students get the opportunity to take a practice, standardized test in a real setting, it's always good practice. Obviously, if you're thinking, you might be eligible for that, commendation or national merit, semifinalist or finalist, that can factor into it. But certainly in terms of mapping out a plan, we can do it based on that summer testing score. Sometimes families like to have a PSAT score just because, students are getting their scores back and, they want to not feel left out that they didn't get a score back, so sometimes that can play into it. And also sometimes students they want a more recent test, like if they did it in July, they've been now back in school, September, October, it gives them a sense in terms of where they are. But to answer your question, I mean, certainly, I mean, no, I mean, we got kind of that information we need from the diagnostic SAT. Yep.
Kids who are pursuing medicine or technology, for them, would you, you would recommend them SAT or ACT?
So the question is if for instance we're going, I know my students pursuing medicine or some kind of STEM major, is it better to go ACT because it has that quote science section on it? Colleges do not care. Because whether you do SAT or ACT, because for most of those programs it's going to fall under like the school of arts and sciences, where students they're going to be exposed to science classes, some humanities classes. But to answer your question, no, they're not. They don't give a preference for an SAT or an ACT score if you're pursuing any a certain type of major. It's not going to impact that.
So actually, on a follow-up to that, you did mention about the subject test.
Yep.
The colleges don't care, or it doesn't really matter, except for the ones who require the
Yep.
subject test. So if that's optional, or is it based on the school?
Yeah. So in terms of if you're applying to a school that requires, the three that require, they're going to want math and they're going to want science. But on that recommended list. Yeah, it's up to the student in terms of which 2 or 3 they might end up submitting. But again, just as the asterisk to that, if you're looking at specific majors or specific programs within colleges, that's where that third slide list came from. Sometimes there are specific subject tests that they want to see. But for your general liberal arts education and your College of Arts and Sciences, if you're applying to Duke, a school like that, they're not going to care. They're not going to care if you send a lit and a science or a math and a lit. It really does not matter to them. And then Stacey, how are we on time?
It's 11:15.
Okay. Yep, in the back there.
Okay, I have 2 questions. First question is, you mentioned that recommend kids take the SAT or ACT at the junior year, or senior year. Okay, if regarding early admission, those types, what's
Yep.
the latest you can take?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So, so our recommendation again, late spring, junior year, fall, senior year. But we know that there's early decision deadlines. So that early decision deadline usually November 1. So the question is how late can we take a test and be able to use that score for that early November 1 deadline? So I can, sorry, look away. Here we have it. Okay, here. So in terms of summer testing, obviously you're going to get those scores back here after junior year in plenty of time to use those scores. On that SAT, so that October 6th test, usually you get these scores back about 2 to 2.5 weeks after the student takes the test. So you will get that October test or that October SAT score back in time for that November 1 deadline. Similarly on that ACT, that September deadline or that September test you'll get back in time for early. This ACT October 27th, that score is going to come back after that early decision deadline. You're going to have to check with the college in terms of their policies. Some colleges for that November 1 deadline, they want everything on file, all scores recorded and on file. Other colleges will take a score pending. So you can tell them, look, we took the October 27th ACT, we're still waiting for that score. As soon as we get that score, we'll send you that score. And some colleges will be like, that's totally fine. So it's going to depend on the college in terms of just how strict they are with that deadline. But in terms of regular decision deadlines, usually those are January 1 or January 15th. All these November tests in fall of senior year, November and December tests, you get those scores back in plenty of time for that regular decision deadline. And we do have students taking these tests exactly for that reason. But thanks for asking that.
And second question is about essay writing. So do you have the information about what are those colleges recommend or required for essay?
Yeah, so the question is, and again, this is just the essay that's part of the SAT and ACT. As part of any application, you're going to have to write, the student's going to have to write a personal statement. That's not that essay. So the question is can you find that list of 20 colleges that require and 30 that recommend? Just put in, here's what I would put in. I would put in James Murphy. He just wrote an article on this, and put on SAT essay, and you'll be able to get a link that shows those updated. But again, colleges are trying to be upfront on their websites in terms of whether they require or recommend the essay, but you can also just ask them. These essays, they're dying a slow death. And a couple years from now, I'm sure we're not even going to be talking about it, but there are still colleges that are considering it. Yep.
So you said that 95% of the schools are score choice.
Yeah.
So assuming, and inferring based on the Congress that if you take the test 3 times, you can potentially get 2 scores for the super score.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, right, exactly. So the question is back to super scoring. Let's say you took it 4 times. Most schools honor score choice. If you took 2 tests and they really do not help your super score in any way, shape, or form, you don't have to send those score reports. You can just send those 2 score reports that are going to build that best super score. Again, the schools that are super scoring, it's not going to hurt you if you send those other ones. And partly this just has to do with cost. Like on the SAT, you can just check a box that says like, yes, send all my scores. You pay one fee for that, which is kind of nice. Whereas on the ACT, there is some cost associated with the super scoring because you're gonna pay every time you send a college a score report. So if you're applying to 8 schools and you're sending 3 score reports, you're essentially going to be paying ACT 24 times to send each of those, which is a little bit frustrating. The other thing just to keep in mind around that, more and more schools are going to what they call self-reporting scores. They're trying to move away from that model where just you'll tell them what your scores are. It's all in good faith. And then when you get in, then you send them the official score reports and they double check it. So it's kind of nice just so you don't end up spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of additional dollars just trying to apply in terms of sending these scores. But not all colleges are doing that yet. So just keep that in mind. Yeah.
Is there any harm to providing it? So assuming you don't take like 4 tests, but you're only taking 3 tests, is there any harm for just providing all of the tests?
Generally not. Again, almost all schools are going to super score it. If you took a test early and it came in a little bit lower, most college admission folks are not going to. It's not going to be a red flag. I mean, our general recommendation is, if it's something really low and they're not super scoring, maybe we'll hold off and not send it. But again, even if you do, it's not going to raise kind of any red flag or anything. Yeah.
You had a recommendation on SAT and the super scoring that you can take multiple times. What about subject SATs?
Yeah, so subject test, it's just a single score. It's on a 200 to 800 point scale. So there's no kind of super scoring that happens there because it is just, you get a score for an individual test. But those colleges that honor score choice, they also honor score choice for subject tests. So if you took 3 subject tests, and 2 came in, really high and 1, student just maybe didn't do so well, and the school you're applying to requires or recommends 2 subject tests, and they honor score, you just send them the 2 highest ones.
But you recommend them taking only once?
Generally on the subject tests, yeah, generally we recommend once, but we do have students who, they might take a math, and maybe they had an off day, so then, they want to try it one more time. But generally, and again, our other recommendations around subject tests, because they're curriculum-based, as that class is ending, that's when we want students to go ahead and take that subject test. So, if they took physics, generally May or June for subject tests when that class ended. I'm trying to find it. Yep, way in the back.
Actually, the LHS question. I looked on the ACT website, and it doesn't look like LHS is a testing site for ACT, but it is for SAT.
We are a testing site for SAT, but not for ACT. So we do offer all of the SAT tests here. I don't know why we don't do ACT. We just have always done SAT. But I always say if you're going to sign up for a testing site here, you want to do it quickly because it does fill up pretty quickly. But there's a lot of schools nearby that will offer the ACT.
Yeah, if you're going down an ACT path, even though it's not offered here at Lexington, like you won't have an issue registering for that ACT. The only caveat to that is just with that July testing date in the summer. If you build that in as part of your plan for that ACT, the number of schools that are open during the summer is very, very small. The number of testing sites that offer it on that July testing date for the ACT, it's very limited. So if you have July ACT after junior year as part of your testing plan, you want to register as early as you can for that, because those sites do fill, and you really don't want to be driving an hour and a half or into New Hampshire to have to take this. Yeah?
When can you start registering?
So generally, I forget exactly when the spring registration opens. It should be open now. I'm not sure on that ACT if it includes July, but all the spring testing dates are now open. So you can register all the way up through June now. And again, check on that ACT for July. It's always a little bit confusing whether they consider that quote a spring test or quote fall test. But at some point, yeah, it will be open, obviously. Sharon, we'll swing back this way.
For the schools that require the essay, do you need to take the essay every time, or is it not dedicated?
Yeah, so the question is so for those schools that require the essay as part of the SAT or ACT, do you need to take it every time? So the answer to that is because almost all schools are super scoring, they're gonna super score that essay score as well. But if, for whatever reason, you are applying to a school that wants the essay, and in all honesty, I don't even know who's on this list, but that requires or recommends the essay and does not super score, then yeah, you might need to end up taking that test every time. But it is going to be at most maybe a handful or maybe one or two schools that are going to fall into that mode. So generally, just doing it once is going to cover the vast majority of students. Just having taken it once will cover them on that.
We have about 5 more minutes.
All right, perfect. Yeah.
So how does the physics subject score test then work? Basically, since physics comes into forth, the senior year, and the school requires it, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So the question is like, if physics is only offered senior year in terms of the subject test, that student, might not end up choosing to take physics as their subject test, depending on where they are. Because yeah, the subject test, it doesn't always align with the school's curriculum in terms of how that curriculum ends up playing out. But that's why, again, there's a lot of choices. Hopefully, maybe they can do a chemistry or something else, that can fulfill that requirement.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, it's not like they say it has to be physics.
No, it doesn't have to be physics.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a choice, and for the ones that are requiring the science, usually it's a math-based science, so it's usually chemistry or physics. So again, this is why we just want to cover it, just to put it on your radar, that generally then those students might go chemistry as opposed to physics. I mean, they can do some self-study too, but generally, there's kind of no need for that, hopefully. Yeah, oh, sorry.
So for senior year, no need for the subject test.
So it depends on what that list ends up being. And it depends on where they end up applying. Think of it, it's really what's going to dictate whether you need subject tests or not is going to be the schools you're applying to. And generally speaking, for like that fall senior year, if you're taking subject tests, generally the students who are taking them, they're taking like the math, which might not be kind of as course specific, or they might be taking the English, or they might be trying a language. But generally speaking, if they're taking like the bio subject test, we want the students to take that bio subject test after that bio course has been completed. But again, this is where the individual planning comes in. These are just kind of general guidelines. There might be exceptions to that.
No, my question is for senior year, the college application is already finished, so no need for the subject test.
Well, again, you're going to apply at the earliest November 1. But for those colleges that, if you end up with Caltech, MIT, or Harvey Mudd, if you haven't taken subject tests by the fall of senior year and you're applying to those schools, you're going to need to take them because that application is not going to be seen as complete without those subject tests. And again, vast majority of students aren't going to need subject tests, but that's why we're talking about it, just to put it on your radar. Because I just don't want, senior year you know, for seniors to be scrambling on this. Yeah, maybe we'll have time for one more, and then I'll be up here if you have, you know, personal questions you want to ask.
So for the AP test, do you recommend waiting until they're seniors, so that they can test the freshman seniors right after they take the course?
In terms of the AP?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for the AP, you know, you'll take that AP test after that AP course is ending. So, you know, if you're in a junior year, and some, I don't know how Lexington High handles it. I mean, some schools out there, if you're enrolled in an AP course, they require you to take, you don't require.
No.
But yeah, generally, like, you want to take that AP test in May. It's done here at the school when that AP course ends. Because that's the course is prepping or gearing towards that test.
Can I just ask, how much does it cost to take an SAT?
Yeah, so the actual cost of it's in the guide. I forget offhand, but there are waivers that you can get through the counseling office here. So if you know, if the cost of these tests is a barrier, you can get a waiver for both the SAT and ACT, so that, you know, students can take it for free. It's not an endless number though, so just keep that in mind.
Great.
All right, again, if you have an individual question, come on up. Thanks everybody for hanging in there.
Thank you very much, everybody.